Hello and welcome to another video from Dazatron's Diorama Llama, and in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make a mined slate base. So this is using all of the scraps and the offcuts that I've been asking you to keep in previous videos, and I've been promising I was going to make a video showing you how to use those little offcuts. So I think this looks quite cool and quite interesting. I hope you do too, and I hope it inspires you to make your own. The great thing is this is an easy make, so it's great for beginners. So to begin with, you need a scrap piece to kind of act as your main base or your foundation for these smaller pieces. So again, this is just an offcut from an earlier make. I'm using an electric foam cutter just to kind of get rid of the square edges. I want this to, I suppose, again, just look a bit more interesting. So I'm just going to kind of curve and round off those edges just to make it look a bit more interesting, really, as I want to see this from the sides. So just very carefully pull away each edge. You can see there's a part of this kind of offcut kind of sticks out, so I'm just going to use that. I'm going to kind of go with that and just let it kind of flow around the end there. I think this is about an inch thickness. It doesn't matter too much, it's just whatever you've got at hand. It could be thicker, it could be thinner, that's absolutely fine. The whole point of this make is to use or recycle your offcuts. Notice I'm not trying to keep a very straight line. I think all of that just adds to the effect. So there we go. So there's my kind of rough cut for my base. Now, because the top of this is quite smooth, I just want to create some ridges, and I just think that will help as I come to add these kind of little tiles a little bit later on. So I'm just moving the cutter up and down and just kind of dragging it backwards, and you can see it starts to then create these kind of ridges. So just continue to do that all the way along the top. Now you could go deeper than what I'm going here if you wish to. It depends really how much of a slant or slope you want when you add your tiles. Or you can just keep it completely flat. It really is up to you. You don't have to do this stage if you don't want to. So I'm just finishing off the top here. And then I'm going to do something similar to the sides. Now with the sides, I'm not actually sticking any tiles on the sides of the base here, but I just think it looks more interesting than that kind of smooth surface. And it just kind of adds a little bit of texture as well. So I'm using the same method again. Just moving the wire cutter up and down, move along the sides, and it would just kind of create this kind of ridge effect. Now I'll keep in mind quite slanted as well, so the lines are kind of moving at an angle. Again, it's up to you whether you want them to be completely vertical or diagonal. Your choice, just whatever you think looks best. Just make sure you do use this technique all the way around. Now at the moment that's quite uniform, so I will be working back into that a little bit later with a file, just to so it doesn't look quite so mechanical. So here's my bag of bits that I've been keeping since I started this channel. So I've got some thicker pieces, yeah, you've got different kind of parts there. This is what I'm really looking for, these kind of thinner bits. And when I was looking at these kind of offcuts, these kind of small kind of slivers, or kind of splinters of styrofoam, they reminded me of the Slate mountain we visited in Wales in the UK. And it literally was just these kind of mounds of these kind of slate tiles just all on top of one another, and they look quite jagged and quite threatening, and I just thought that would actually make a cool base, particularly for a transformer or even a Masters of the Universe figure. I think you could use any figure on this, really. Now you might want to use like some small pliers, particularly when you start to apply the tiles, if you find that easier to use, and a floristry knife again, or a craft knife, just so you can cut your pieces to shape, really. Now some of the pieces, or the offcuts that I've got here, were a little bit thicker than what I wanted them to be, so again I'm just kind of slicing off the top of some of these pieces just so I can get it to the shape and the size that I want. And again, that really is up to you. You can use thicker pieces if you want, but because this is meant to be slate, they should be quite thin, so you don't want your pieces to be too thick. Yeah, so just be selective over the pieces that you use. It's really easy to cut into this kind of styrofoam, so it's not difficult, but I would suggest keeping your knife sharpened, just because you'll get a much neater cut. And the great thing about these tiles are they should be kind of jagged and non-uniform, so you can really get away with not doing a lot, really. The little pieces kind of work for themselves. It's mainly trying to cut them into more of a, I suppose, a square or rectangle shape, but again, not really neat, not really tidy. You might want some kind of triangular pieces as well, just so they look a little bit more jagged. So once you've got a few pieces and you get kind of the idea of what you're trying to do, you might then want to just kind of put them in place and see how they start to kind of pile up on each other. It's a good way of just kind of checking the size as well, because you might want bigger pieces or smaller pieces. Again, it's up to you. So what you want is that kind of piled effect. So you can see here I've added quite a few of these pieces, and I've used some more kind of jagged edges and kind of put them upright, and I just think that creates a bit more interest as you start to look at it from different angles. Do remember, a base is, it's almost like a sculpture, so you want to see it from different sides, different perspectives. So I've just cut some more of these kind of square kind of pieces, and I'm just going to show you how I glue them to the base. So I'm using something called Mod Podge here, which is kind of a strong PVA type glue. You could just use PVA, you could use Gorilla Glue, like I've used in the past, and you simply brush it on with an old brush. Yeah, put plenty on there. It does dry clear. So that's it, simply smooth that out. Don't worry about smoothing it out too much though. And of course it is worthwhile putting glue on top of the tiles that are already in place, so you can kind of start to stick them together. You will be coating the whole thing as well with Mod Podge, just because it kind of creates a bit of a seal and makes it a bit stronger. And as we're using thinner pieces of styrofoam, again, it just adds a bit of strength to what you're doing. And then just take your little pieces and just kind of move them in, slot them in place, whether that's on top or underneath or in between. Just find what works. And if you need to add more glue, just do so. Now what you will find as the glue Obviously it's quite wet and it allows you to kind of continue to move things around. Sometimes the tiles will shift and will kind of displace a little bit, so you might have to keep moving things back until you're happy. But once you are happy with the layout and the setup, you can just leave it then to dry, and you can always add more later, which is what I've done here. So you can see the tiles are starting to move as I'm adding more glue on top. But it's really easy just to kind of put things back in place, so don't worry too much about that. As I said, this is a really easy build. There's no particular pattern as to where you put these things. It's just a case of, you know, placing them until you feel quite happy with the aesthetics, really. So what I'm doing here, I've not finished the base. I'm just getting an idea of how the figures will stand on top. Because this is a longer piece, I quite like the idea of like an action or a fight pose. And I'm just using you know, regular chug figures there. So you can see I'm just kind of adding some pieces in a more upright position, and this just adds a bit of an anchor or kind of a stop point for the feet of the figures that you're placing on top, and that would just stop the figures from falling over quite so easily. So I'm just taking the floristry knife and I'm just distressing the sides so they don't look quite so neat and uniform. So don't worry if you kind of get any kind of jagged or kind of rough surfaces here. That's kind of the idea. That's the look that we're going for. So just chip away carefully at the sides, just so it adds a bit more texture, really. So I'm just doing that on each side until I'm happy. You could do this before you add the tiles on top. And then I'm just using a file just to distress it a little bit more. So you can see, I think that looks a lot more pleasing and gives it a better effect. So I'm just checking again how the feet sit next to the kind of slate tiles. So you can see the pieces that are kind of jutting out kind of stop the feet from moving. And again here I've got a piece either side of the foot just to hold that in place. So this is pretty much the finished piece now. I've added a lot more tiles to the top. Exactly the same method as before. You can see I've added a lot more of the kind of jagged tiles that are sticking up. Not just where the feet would be, but in different places. And that just gives you some flexibility if you want to move your figures around on top. So you can see how it looks from different angles. And it is worth really piling up those tiles. It just adds to the effect. So we're just going to take a softer brush. To be fair, you could use any brush for this. The reason why I use a soft brush because I don't want it too textured, whereas a harder or older brush would start to create streaks on top of the tiles. So again, it depends on the finish that you're looking for. So what's really important with this stage is that you really get into all those kind of nooks and crannies, because there's lots of kind of gaps and spaces in between the tiles as you've built it up. It's really important you do this as well after the initial kind of drying phase. So once you've built up your base and you've let it dry completely, and then add a layer of the Mod Podge on top just to seal it off. So I've also added a base coat of black here, because slate tiles tend to be quite dark. I've got a mixing palette, I've got some water, again I've got some couple of kind of flat brushes, a bit of toilet roll or rag just to dry off the brush, and I'm just adding a bit of white to my palette. Probably added a little bit too much there, and I'm going to add a little bit of black as well and just make a lighter grey. You don't want to go too light at first, keep it quite dark, and you can always go lighter later. So just use the black that's already on the brush just to mix it in with the white. Now I've got quite a lot there. You don't actually need much for this dry brush technique. You've seen me use this technique many times before. So I'm going for kind of a mid-grey. And then I'm just going to wipe off the excess off the brush. And then to start with, I'm going to go quite light. And the reason why I do that is just to see if I've taken enough paint off the brush to see how it looks on the tiles. If you do find it comes up a bit too light, you can just rub it in with your finger. And then when you're happy that there's not too much paint on your brush, you can then go a little bit firmer and just brush backwards and forwards quite vigorously, and that would give you this kind of dry brush effect where it just kind of catches the edges, it lifts up the texture. Then you might want to use a lighter grey just to kind of catch the edges of the tiles a little bit more. So I've done that here with just kind of the corners. So I'm not kind of brushing so fast over the top here, I'm just kind of catching the edge, and it just helps each kind of tile to stand out against the ones in the background. And I'm quite happy with the overall effect of this. I think there's lots of interest as you see it from different angles. So here is the final base with the figures on top in this kind of fighting pose. And yeah, I'm really pleased with how that works. This is the first base I've made for more than one figure, and I think it's really effective. And to say that these are cheap chug figures at about £20 each, I think they look really cool on top of that base. So I hope you've enjoyed watching this tutorial. I hope you have a go. Welcome to all my new subscribers, and I'll see you again soon.